This next bit is so disgusting. Apparently, his bedtime habits as a single man left a lot to be desired, and a collection of scrunched up soiled tissues usually lay scattered around the bed each morning for the staff to collect after they had made up his bed. What in the world is that? How could you be such a disgusting human being? That guy is literally the worst! Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. Today we're going to be doing 2 chapters from the Housekeeper's Diary. It's so good, you guys. It's so good. It's probably one of my favorite books I've read so far, just because it's different. It's different in the way it presents the details. There's no sources say and a source close to the couple and it was rumored that. None of that. You know, she's naming names. Her son's on the record, and he also worked for the royal family. She's on the record. Obviously, she's the one writing the book, but she's naming all these other people who worked for them and, you know, like giving full conversations that they had behind the scenes. She's really ripping off the veneer of this sort of polished and pristine family who are engaged in dramatic episodes of temper. Just their personal habits are kind of slovenly. But she just like lays out the facts and then you get to decide how you feel about that. She's not going after anybody. Now, she's not huge fans of Sarah and Andrew, but quite frankly, who among us is? This feels very refreshing to read something that is so evidently devoid of her bias when it comes to the main characters in the story. And I really appreciate the fact that she is willing to put all of this out there and just let you decide what you think about it without trying to shape the narrative for you. It's very refreshing. Okay, so enough of my yang. Let's just get on with what we want to talk about. We're starting out with chapter 3. It says, Happy Christmas, and we're coming at the end of 1985. So she has this book divided into years that she was there. So this is the end of 1985. And we begin this chapter with Diana. Diana is in the staff kitchen. She's just over there gnawing on their leftovers and being a little bit gross about it, honestly. Like the way she describes it, all of the adjectives that Wendy chooses creates such a visual picture for us. She's very precise in her language. But she starts the chapter off by saying, Small slices of roast beef dropped to the floor as Diana hacked away at the joint on the kitchen sideboard. Larger, juicier pieces were expertly cut from the bone and quickly fingered into her mouth as the princess ravenously attacked the remnants of the staff lunch. That's quite a picture. This is great, she declared between barely finished mouthfuls. I often think you lot have more interesting meals than we do. Lightly tanned and dressed casually in a bright wool sweater and cords, Diana looked sensational. She and the prince had returned from a tour of Australia several weeks earlier, but she was still on a high. It was Saturday evening, and the princess was talking about the film premiere of Back to the Future at London's Empire the previous Tuesday. It was such fun and so exciting, she giggled, as a small piece of meat dropped to the floor. And there were so many photographers. I think they actually got some very good pictures of me. Did you see them all back here? I went to one of the cupboards in the pantry and came back with a pile of newspapers packed with photographs of the occasion. Oh, let me see them, shouted Diana excitedly, letting the knife clatter on the tile floor. I don't think I've seen some of these yet. Over numerous cups of tea, Diana, her detective sergeant Barry Manicky, Mervyn, that's the cook, and I sat around the table poring over the pictures. Diana seemed to come alive. Her eyes sparkled as she chattered away 10 to the dozen about the film. No, she squealed at one stage. Barry, have you seen this one? Makes me look absolutely dreadful. A picture of Diana in evening dress was taken from an unusual angle, making her shoulders look slightly hunched and her nose rather large. Why have they used this one? She moaned. So many of the others were better. Why are they trying to make me look horrid? For nearly an hour, we compared the pictures, flattering her on the good ones and trying to convince her that the less complimentary shots were not quite as dreadful as she thought. It was beginning to be a bit boring. Yeah, I should think so. Sitting there trying to tell somebody who's already super famous. I mean, clearly everyone likes her. There's no reason for her to be over here tell me honestly, is it really that bad? I mean, I hate how big my nose looks there. Of all the ones they could have chosen. But are you sure that people know it's just a bad angle? I mean, when you look at it, what do you think? Does it just look like a bad angle to you? Or would you, if you didn't know me, would you think that's really what I look like? You promise? Because I hate that one. I mean, can you imagine sitting there trying to like pat someone on the back and be like, it's okay. There's like 50,000 pictures here. It's going to be okay. Wendy goes on to explain the neediness of Diana. Are you sure, Wendy? She pleaded after I told her how one slightly gawky pose reminded me of a model I'd seen in a recent edition of Vogue. You don't think it makes me look like a witch? As she left the room, I exchanged a glance with Mervyn. Mervyn's always good for a word. Later that evening, after Diana had gone to her room, and as Charles surrounded himself with papers in his study, I went up to the staff sitting room to chat with Barry Manicky. Now, we're going to go on for some minute about Barry Manicky. Now, it's Wendy's feeling that there was nothing actual between Barry and Diana, that there was a lot of flirtation that went on, but it was mostly because that was how Diana liked it. She liked the attention that Barry gave her, but that Barry was just trying to do his job to satisfy her and that there wasn't anything real behind it. I don't know. I mean, I just don't know how long you can flirt with somebody that is very attractive and famous and not feel something about it. I'm not saying he was looking to have this full-flung affair with her, but I mean, an emotional affair? Certainly. But that's not necessarily how Wendy sees it. And Wendy was there, so let's see what Wendy says. She says that Barry was Diana's favorite detective, and everyone, including me, adored him. He was such a colorful and easygoing character. Tubby, gregarious, and fun, he was an ideal personal protection officer for the princess. He held a very privileged, though unspoken position because he was so obviously favored by Diana. She hung on to his every word, flirted with him outrageously, and pulled his leg in a way that suggested the two of them were very close. There have been many rumors about them having an affair, but I am sure that is completely untrue. For Diana, Barry was simply a friend, someone she could rely on and trust. She had, after all, to entrust him with her life, and needed him as moral support on all her public engagements. I had quickly come to realize that Diana needed constant reassurance, and Barry was one of the few, along with her dresser, who would give it to her. One day, as they were leaving Highgrove for a job, Diana turned to him in the hall. Flashing a confident smile, since she obviously knew what his answer would be, she said, "Barry, how do I look? Do you think these are the right earrings?" She pulled and smoothed down a skin-tight evening dress and ran her fingers through her hair, which had been cut that morning. "Do I look all right?" she repeated. "Sensational, as you know you do," laughed Barry as he walked towards the car door. "I could quite fancy you myself." "But you do already, don't you?" quipped Diana coquettishly. "Escort me to my car, if you please." It was Barry, the son of working-class London parents, to whom Diana turned when she was unhappy and depressed. And it was Barry who would hug her when she was crying and give her the reassurance that she needed. He was discreet. He never boasted or talked about how close he was to the princess, but his relationship with her upset other officers, especially Colin Trimming, the prince's PPO, personal protection officer, who considered that he was overstepping the mark. Barry was later to confide to me that Trimming had warned him about being, quote, over-friendly with the princess and told him to, quote, cool it. "What can I do about it?" he asked me, sweeping his hand through his thinning light brown hair. "I mean, it's ridiculous for someone to even think I'm more than her detective." He went on to describe the time Diana broke down in tears a few hours before a public engagement. She kept on saying she couldn't go ahead with it and just collapsed into my arms, he said. "I hugged her and stopped her crying. What else would you have done?" Well, I mean, I just think that that's a really easy thing to say. How could anybody think that something's going on here? Well, how could somebody not think something's going on? She's in an unhappy marriage. She's very close with you. You're a man of the opposite sex who's willing to give her attention. I mean, it's not that far-fetched that people would think, oh, could something be happening here? Is something going on between the two of you? I mean, that's a little bit of a weak argument to be like, that's preposterous. Is it, though? And according to him, it's not as though he threw his arms open to her and was like, fall into my arms, babe. But, I mean, you did hug her and stop her crying and give her a reason to think that she could come to you like that. I don't know. But then again, if he had not done those things, I think she would have seen to it that he was fired because she wanted somebody who could play that role in her life and give her that little dopamine hit when she was sad. Anyway, the book goes on to say that whether the prince was jealous or whether he was concerned about how friendly his wife was becoming with her detective, I'll never know. But all the police officers had a report to Colin, letting him know about anything that had happened when they were on duty with Diana. And every time she tapped Barry's arm or said affectionately, "What would I do without you?" it was noted down and reported. In the end, her light, cheerful gestures were totally misinterpreted and led to Barry's downfall, and he was moved away to different duties. 2 years later, he was killed in a freak road accident. Yes, I mean, I don't know. I think Wendy's kind of giving her a bit of a pass, this light, cheerful gesture, and always being like, what would I do without you? How do you think I look? Do you think I'm sexy, Barry? I mean, what husband would appreciate that? If the prince was jealous, he didn't show it, that's one thing. But it's a bad look for everybody else to see the prince's wife being so openly affectionate to somebody else. So whether the prince cared or not, it's just not a look. Colin Trimming was and is a very reliable detective, and the prince holds him in extremely high regard. It was he who accompanied Charles on his visits to Camilla in the early days. There's a level of trust between them that would never be doubted or broken. Diana used to find his power quite intimidating, since she knew that everything she did was being watched and scrutinized. Wherever she went, whomever she spoke to, she knew that everything would be reported back to Trimming, as she called him, and passed on to Charles. It's like living in a nightmarish police state, she would often say to me, only half joking. Well, for somebody who pretends like he doesn't notice that his wife is clearly flirting with the help, Prince Charles kept a note of everything that went on in his house in Highgrove, so it just doesn't stand to reason that he sort of had developed this massive blind spot here, because he's an incredibly fastidious person, especially about every minor detail of his home. And the book goes on to give us an example. Before going home to the lodge that evening, I went into the hall to check if all the lights were off. There was a note on the hall table from the prince to his valet, Michael Fawcett. Please make sure all the lights are off. We need a bulb for the right-hand picture light on the mantelpiece in the hall, the one pointing at the picture with Prince of Wales feathers on the frame. It was signed with a large C. For a man with such a busy schedule and royal duties coming out of his ears, it was amusing to think he still bothered about the lights being left on at night. Well, that is interesting. And interesting that he could micromanage such minor details. But then he would just sort of be not quite in the picture when it came to his wife's relationship with her bodyguard. I find it hard to believe he didn't notice. So Wendy goes on to talk about some of her housekeeping duties, and she talks about how it was at this point in her employment that she finally got the Buckingham Palace Guide to Royal Housekeeping. And she spends a couple pages talking about that. But it's not especially interesting because it's all the sorts of things you would imagine that she would have to do. So I won't read all of that word for word. But I do think that the final word in this rule book was that whenever there was a workman or outsider in the house, whoever it was, there needed to be a member of staff in attendance, and any personal items or photographs had to be covered up if there was a workman on the premise. So talk about a lot of work there. Okay. Let's continue on with the interpersonal relationship between Charles and Diana. Wendy goes on to say that on this particular day, William and Harry had breakfast in the nursery with Barbara, while Charles and Diana came down to the dining room. You could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. As the coffee pot was taken through, all heard Diana shriek, "Oh, for God's sake, Charles!" and then the sound of a banging door and footsteps running up to her bedroom. It was, unfortunately, going to be one of those days. I was already upstairs doing the bathrooms, but had fortunately made a start on the prince's room and not Diana's. I was carefully placing his teddy back on the top of his rust-colored bedspread as I heard her rush into her room and fling herself down on her double bed. She was crying uncontrollably, and I felt trapped in a terrible dilemma. All my natural instincts told me to go next door and comfort her, but it would have been totally inappropriate, misconstrued as overstepping the mark. In the case of one footman who was exceptionally close to the princess and who did comfort her at times like this, it led to his being moved to other duties. And the princess's crying fits and moods were at times no worse than those experienced by many parents coming to terms with a daughter's difficult adolescence. So, while she's standing there trying to decide what she should do, should she go in and say something to Diana? Should she offer her comfort? Or should she just ignore it and pretend like it's not happening? Her eyes fall on the prince's teddy bear. Now, obviously we know that he has the teddy bear. We talked about it in Spare. We even talked about it in the last chapter. But I did not know about this part. She says, I looked at the prince's teddy, an ancient patched-up cuddly toy that was packed by his valet in a plastic shirt bag and accompanied the prince everywhere. I could see a bit of stuffing starting to peep through Teddy's left arm, and made a mental note to send him back to Charles' nanny, Mabel Anderson, the only woman allowed to do repairs, who would cover the area with a small patch of chamois leather. Looking at Teddy, knowing that he would be chauffeur-driven for his repairs, and hearing the sounds of sobbing coming from Diana's room, I felt caught up in some dreadful, surreal tragedy. Yeah. I mean, what is this nightmarish world that she's found herself in? So odd. And here's the thing. I've given him a wide berth for carrying that teddy bear around. Do I find it slightly odd that a man of his age would? Well, a lot of people have stuffed toys that they kept from childhood just because it has such significance to them and was such a point of comfort for them when they were young. So I throw no shade at owning it. The fact that it accompanies him everywhere is interesting. I think most of us, if we have a stuffed animal from our past, is something that we keep as a memento, but probably wouldn't take with us on vacation. This bit about Teddy needing repairs and that the only person who's allowed to patch up the teddy bear is his former nanny, Mabel Anderson. Is that lady still alive? And that that this is an arrangement that they have is surreal. As I walked down the back staff stairs, I could hear Barbara leading William and Harry, who was still in nappies, down to the dining room. William ran straight to his father, shouting, "Papa!" The prince, who'd stayed by himself in the dining room for nearly an hour after Diana's outburst, rushed towards his son, scooped him up in his arms. Diana's papers, the Mail on Sunday and the Sunday Express, were left untouched on the table. Now, we are going to be introduced to dresser number 1. She seems to make only an appearance in this chapter, because after this incident, I don't know exactly what happened, but she gone. And in the next chapter, we have a different dresser. At this point, the dresser was Faye Marchelsea, and I hope I'm saying that last name right. Wendy says that with an hour to go before I had to set the staff table for lunch, I went along to have a chat with Faye Marchelsea, the dresser, in her room. Faye was slaving over an ironing board. On her bed were several outfits that the princess would be wearing later that afternoon. Happy-go-lucky Faye, whose principal ambition at that time was to meet a suitable man and get married, was having a moan about being at Highgrove and all the ironing she had to do. I sometimes wonder why I ever took this job at all, she said as she carefully took the creases out of a heavy skirt. I know it sounds glamorous and all at first, but really all we are here for is to skivvy around after some very spoiled people who, if they're not crying their eyes out, are ridiculously demanding. It's not as if we were paid very much, is it? Well, that's a pretty honest statement, Faye. Hope your boss didn't hear. Well, don't hold your breath, because who's creeping around in the background, listening at doors, but Diana, who apparently was known for this. Diana would take her shoes off, go down barefoot around the staff corridors, and listen at doors to see if there was anything bad about her. And then she'd get upset about what she heard. Well, that's a really great way to get your feelings hurt. Wendy goes on to say, I made no reply, hearing a noise outside the door. I put my finger to my lips to tell Faye to keep quiet as I looked out. I just caught sight of Diana, barefoot, tiptoeing down the staff corridor. She had obviously been hovering around outside and had heard the tail end of Faye's complaints. Oh, God, muttered Faye after she had gone away. That really has torn it. I was rapidly beginning to understand that royal service was just as precarious for the staff as for the family itself. While the royals could complain about the whispers and lack of privacy they endured through living in a large household, the staff too had to live under similar conditions. Diana, an arch spy, was expert at creeping about barefoot and hearing comments made about her behind her back. She'd obviously heard everything, because within a few minutes the phone in Faye's room rang. Faye was to go up to the princess's room at once. This is not going to look good for Faye. This is pretty bad. Of course, in later chapters, we're going to hear the way Diana ripped into her other dresser, who had never done anything at all to receive the absolute dressing down that Diana will give her next dresser. But for Faye, she has some choice words. Later that day, she recounted the terrible dressing down she had received. She walked through the heavy fire door and into Diana's pink and white papered bedroom to find the princess staring out the window overlooking the back of the house. How foreboding. Speaking slowly at first, Diana said in a controlled, flat voice, Do you quite realize, Faye, how lucky you are to be here? It costs us a great deal to look after you all, and we feed you and house you. Where do you think that you'd be without us? Warming to the argument, she continued in a slightly louder tone. How dare you complain about things when you have literally everything done for you? She didn't seem to care that she had heard Faye complaining by subterfuge. She wanted Faye to apologize for what she said and to sound genuine about it. The princess was at her most effectively brutal that day, and when I saw Faye later, she looked quite shaken by the confrontation. And well, at this point, you want to just rail against Princess Diana because, she heard this, and, maybe Faye shouldn't have been saying those things, but
Diana wouldn't have known, been any the wiser, but she wanted to hear it. She wanted to get her feelings hurt, and then she wants to have a big fit about it and, have a power play about it. So, you might be sitting here thinking, well, what's Diana's problem? What a jerk. But Wendy comes in with the fairness, which is why I like her. And she says the princess did, however, have a point of sorts. Although the pay was appalling, considering the hours we worked and the discretion required as members of the royal household, the staff were allowed many perks and discounts not available to the general public. In those days, most of us had grace and favor houses, with the duchy paying all bills. If anything went wrong, we could call in plumbers and electricians at any time of the day or night and send the bills to the household. All food was effectively free, since when the royal chefs were on duty, they had to cook for us as well as for the prince and princess. Another source of great delight for the staff was a discount available by well-known stores and manufacturers, sometimes amounting to 80%. So, maybe they weren't getting a huge paycheck, but they were certainly being compensated in every other area of life. Naturally, the same discounts applied to the royal family. Charles might seem set in his ways about lots of things, but when it came to soaps and lotions, he could be quite adventurous and make full use of the manufacturer's generosity. He would ask his valet to lay out various types and brands on the bed in the blue room to try, and for a while was keen on Flora's Rose Geranium Blend, which we all thought quite racy for him. Every bath had a big block of this translucent soap, but one day Charles had a violent change of heart about the smell and ordered it all to be thrown out. Nobody quite seemed to know what had changed his mind. But if that seems a bit wasteful, hold your horses, because you're about to hear about some of the wildest waste I've ever heard. This is insane. She writes that on top of this were all the free gifts sent by the lorry load to the couple either at Kensington Palace or at Highgrove. When that happened, there was a general free-for-all after the prince and princess had their first choice. The rest was burnt in big incinerators at the back of the house. It never ceased to amaze me how many gifts and clothes were thrown away. Even after the first few months at Highgrove, it would make me feel quite sick with anger at such waste. The clothes and ornaments were systematically put into black plastic bin liners every month and stuffed by patio workmen into the incinerator. When I asked Faye once whether anyone would notice if we took just one beautiful blouse, she replied, "It's more than my job's worth. I'm told we have to burn the stuff rather than let it fall into the hands of someone who would try and sell it for its royal associations." Faye looked quite upset as she watched hundreds of pounds worth of clothes go up in smoke. See, I thought that the royal family were not allowed to accept gifts. Is that a new rule? Possibly, since this book came out. Maybe when this book came out, people considered that so scandalous that they've changed the rule. But Harry and Meghan were constantly trying to receive free gifts, and that was like this major faux pas on their part. And everyone's like, that's not allowed. You can't ask for free gifts. But it would appear that free gifts were just being sent to these people without any questions at all. Now, one thing I don't quite understand about this paragraph, and maybe you guys can help me understand, is that she says all this free stuff would come by the lorry load, and that after the prince and princess had their first choice, it was a general free-for-all. But then she says they weren't allowed to take any of the clothes, and she really wanted to save some of that stuff from just being burnt up, but that, it would have cost them their job. But I thought they just said it was a general free-for-all. Does that mean a general free-for-all for any of the royal family? Like, was Andrew allowed to come and have his pick, and Edward, and, so on and so forth? I don't quite get that, but regardless, I am shocked that they would just throw things away rather than donate them. How wasteful. Well, disappointments continue to abound for poor Wendy, who's looking on at the plastic bags full of perfectly good things just being burnt up. Meanwhile, it's Christmas, and she's got to decorate these Christmas trees, and she is none too thrilled about what she's being given to decorate the trees with. She writes and says it was just a few weeks away from Christmas, and 2 trees had been ordered from the local arboretum in Tetbury, free of course for the prince and princess. For people who had so much money, I was beginning to understand how they retained it. They never seemed to spend anything. Patty and Fred from the estate came in with the trees. One, the larger one, was to go up in the hall, and the other in the nursery on the top of the floor. When I came to unpack the boxes of decorations from the cellar, I was quite surprised at how naff and ordinary they were. There were multicolored little animals and star shapes, fairies, and lots of glittering cheap stuff. We attached baubles as well, but the finished tree in the hall was not, quite honestly, what I would have expected. It did not seem to be a priority to make everything look magical and wonderful downstairs. That was reserved for the boys in the nursery. Now, Christmas is approaching, obviously, with these Christmas trees. And she goes on to tell about the strange custom of them buying their own gift, wrapping their own gift, and then giving it back to the royal family so that at the Christmas party for the staff, they would all line up and then their present would be handed back to them. That just seems so junky to me. The book goes on to say that a week before the Highgrove staff party on Sunday, December 15th, we were all given £20 to buy ourselves a Christmas present. How generous. I remember thinking how odd it was to go out and choose one's own present. It might have been better to have been given a cash Christmas bonus along with a token present chosen by the boss. However, I went into Tetbury and I bought myself a Parker pen, which I then carefully wrapped and handed over to the butler. Shortly before noon that day, we all lined up in the green and red dining room, which stank of diesel fumes because the flue was near the boiler. Charles, Diana, William, and Harry walked down the line joking and chatting with us as they handed over the gifts. Both Charles and Diana threw themselves into the occasion. They seemed genuinely happy to be surrounded by all their staff, from butlers down to the temporary gardeners, handing out presents and wishing everyone a happy Christmas. Wine was served freely, and by the end of a splendid meal, most people were swapping intimate stories and generally letting their hair down. William and Harry had gone up to the nursery, but Charles and Diana circulated from table to table. Both wore funny hats and laughed and joked as if they didn't have a care in the world. It made quite a change from the usual household drama. After coffee, Charles made a speech. He apologized for his somewhat eccentric ways, cracking a joke at several people's expense, and then finished by saying, "All of you must remember that you are our ambassadors. What you do and how you behave reflects directly on us. Thank you, and Merry Christmas." As everyone applauded, Patty turned to me and squeezed my thigh. "Well, do you think you'll stay then?" he said with a wink. "It's not so bad, is it?" Well, when everyone's happy and the wine's flowing, it's not so bad, is it? But it's about to be bad because who's coming over for a visit? Sarah and Andrew. Y'all, okay, sometimes the way I read things, I think I inject a little bit of my own opinion into the writing that maybe isn't there. I'm reading the word right off the page, but sometimes perhaps I tinge Wendy's words with my own feelings about them. But I can tell you right now, there's not any of my injection in how she feels about Sarah and Andrew. She didn't like these people. She goes on to say that bright early morning sunlight broke through the small panes of glass in Diana's bedroom as Evelyn Dagley, the princess's dresser, and I changed the royal sheets. Okay, so note that name. Evelyn Dagley's her dresser now. Don't know what happened to Faye, but Faye's gone. Although a January frost had sealed a hard layer of silver over the garden and trees outside, Diana's simply decorated room was sweltering as a result of Highgrove's cantankerous central heating being turned up to its maximum level. I ran my hands over the bottom sheet to smooth it out and stopped. My fingers closed over 2 pieces of pink wax, pinched into the shape of 2 ugly fluorescent slugs. I looked up into Evelyn's elfin face and dark eyes. She shrieked with laughter. "They must have been together last night, if only for a while," she snorted. "And those things in your hand are the princess's earplugs. She has to wear them every time she shares a bed with the prince because of his snoring." Okay, these earplugs. The discovery of the earplugs made me chuckle. I couldn't help wondering if she put them in straight away in front of Charles or waited until he temporarily dozed off by her side. Evidently, Ev mentioned something to the princess because later that day she came across me in the staff corridor and stopped for a chat. "I heard you found my plugs this morning very amusing, Wendy," she giggled. "The thing is, I cannot stand his snoring, and rather than try and sleep with my fingers in my ears or a pillow wrapped round my head, I picked up this idea from long-distance flights. Not bad for ingenuity, don't you think?" Always so eager to give herself a pat on the back, but, I mean, duh, what other option would you have? If somebody's snoring right in your face, of course you're going to put some earplugs in. "Not bad for ingenuity, is it?" Yeah, if you've got a brain. Okay, that's a little heavy-handed, but it just seems like I would just be so annoyed with her always, all the day long, needing everyone's approval for every little thing she does. Well, Wendy says it all seemed so funny and lighthearted at the time, but the snoring was later to become a pretext for their not sharing a bed, as with so many married couples. It led to a permanent regime of separate bedrooms. The princess would say that she wanted to go to bed early and didn't want to be disturbed by her husband as he came up hours later. What's interesting is that Wendy seems always so surprised that they don't share a bed, but we've all been led to believe that that's just royal custom, that you both have your own beds, and then, like, if you want to be intimate, you can get in the other person's bed, but isn't that just how they do? Like, you have your own bed, and you just always do, but, like, this has blown Wendy away from the beginning. So I can't decide if she just was ignorant or if we're ignorant and she's really the one that was right, and this really is odd. I don't know. Anyway, she says, "I used to think that it was perhaps at this stage of their marriage in 1986 that they missed the opportunity of some sort of long-term reconciliation. If only they had made more of an effort to get things working, then the marriage might have turned out all right after all." For in 1986, Diana was still making an effort to be loving and affectionate to her husband. So this is like a real dilemma. And like, they would go off and on being into each other. So Diana would go and be really affectionate with Charles and try to give him hugs or little kisses, and he would be embarrassed by it or just kind of like shrug it off, like it was like, get off me. And then that would hurt her feelings. She'd run off crying, and then he'd, weekly call after her, come back, I do want a hug, don't be like that, darling. And then, of course, when he would try to be sweet and kind with her, he'd come in and give her a little kiss, and then she'd be like, get off me, people can see, you're embarrassing me. So both of them were just like two ships passing in the night constantly. They were just so uncomfortable around each other. And this discomfort and never knowing exactly how your affections were going to land led them to want to avoid one another because it was just so awkward all the time. Wendy transitions from talking about the awkwardness between Charles and Diana to talking about the arrival of Sarah for this particular weekend. The sound of laughter filled the hall as a throaty upper-crust voice of a slovenly female shouted out, "Cooey, is there anyone there?" It was Saturday afternoon on January 25th, and Sarah Ferguson had just arrived. Fergie, busts up in the place, and she starts asking, where are the men folk? And Diana's like, it's only me. Charles isn't here this weekend. But, Andrew is coming. I don't even have the nanny with me this weekend. And Sarah starts joking about, well, where's the drink cupboard then? Let's go get sloshed. So without the help of the nanny, that means a little extra work for Wendy. She says since there was no nanny, I said that I would assist Evelyn with her work, as she might be called on by Diana to help out with William and Harry. I walked up to greet Sarah Ferguson in the hall, taking her rather tatty, battered old suitcase up to the green room where she would be staying. Now, y'all, listen to the description of the clothes in this girl's suitcase. She says, I unzipped the case and I laid Fergie's clothes out on the bed. A pair of old jeans, a thick tweed skirt, and several nondescript blouses. It had all been packed in a hurry and was crumpled, and some of it didn't even look particularly clean. What? It extends to her underwear, unfortunately. Ev arrived at this point, and I left her to sort out the clothes that needed pressing. Just look at this stuff, will you? She tutted as she went through a pile of the gray-white underwear. God help us all. Okay, how wrong to throw a bunch of junk into a suitcase, and then it's not clean, but you're like, they'll unpack it and wash it for me, so that's fine. Like, I would be humiliated to let somebody touch my dirty underwear. Humiliated. And I just can't even imagine thinking so little of somebody else that you wouldn't be embarrassed. Like that another human being would touch my dirty underwear. I cannot even. And I don't care if they work for me. They can't. It seems strange to me. But I'll say something else. You see this same attitude with the way Diana does too. The way she treats the staff, and it's going to become even more obvious as the book goes on. She doesn't think of these people as human. That's why she doesn't care if she's slovenly. If she doesn't care if she's over there chewing on a lamb bone, meat juices dripping down her chin, food falling to the floor, just being messy, eating chocolate and crackers in the bed, sleeping in the crumbs. It's like she doesn't really think of these people as on her level. So their opinion of her is like next to nothing. Like, what does she care? If they think that she's slovenly, it's like, whatever, Anyway, on the way down the back stairs, I heard that Prince Andrew had just arrived. Dressed in heavy corduroy trousers, a checked shirt, and a dark yellow sweater, he greeted Diana extremely affectionately with a kiss on either cheek. Then he made a bellowing noise and gave Sarah a bear hug, kissing her full on the lips. I can see who's the more popular one here, laughed Diana. William and Harry loved seeing their uncle, and Andrew knew this. It allowed him quite shamelessly to play the buffoon in front of them, entertaining both excited children with numerous practical jokes. He had them in fits by firing a water pistol at Sarah and Diana as they walked around the back garden. Later on, as Diana was preparing to take them up to bed, he kept them entertained with strange farting noises, pulling grotesque expressions that William in particular thought was hilarious. Well, that all sounds like a fun uncle, a little annoying, but still fun if you're a kid. But the thing is that it doesn't seem like Andrew's behavior stops with children when it comes to just the farting jokes and the bathroom humor. I cannot with that kind of garbageness. I just can't. I'm not going to disown you as a friend if you think that kind of humor is funny, but to me, it is disgusting. As a royal child, he'd been brought up, like Charles, to be waited on hand and foot, and as a result tended to barge his way around the house, expecting to be looked after and served for every whim. It was explained to me that it wasn't his fault, simply that he'd been reared in a system that allowed him practically anything he wanted. But see, that doesn't hold up because not everyone in that system acts like such an atrocious monster, as she goes on to explain. There was a childishness of his character that sat somewhat uneasily with the physique of a sturdy 26-year-old man. James told me, quote, this is her son, by the way, Prince Andrew was like his father, the Duke of Edinburgh, and unmistakably the Queen's favorite son. There was an inherited bluffness and directness, which could be off-putting until you realized it was usually just a front for getting through otherwise awkward situations. Unlike Edward, Andrew was the archetypal man's man, whose sense of humor perfectly matched the Windsors' delight in crude, coarse lavatorial jokes. Whoopee cushions were constantly hidden under guest chairs, jokes about farts the stock in trade for his conversational banter. James added that unlike Edward, who was unusually shy and private about getting dressed and undressed in front of staff, Andrew took delight in strutting around his apartment with nothing on, barking instructions as staff hurriedly picked up wet towels and dirty clothes strewn around the room. One occasion James remembered vividly was when he went with Andrew and his detective for a weekend's shooting on the Duke of Westminster's estate. The prince had just gone off for a bath when the bell rang. Come in, shouted Andrew as James knocked on the door. Where the bloody hell are my black socks, the ones with the stripe at the top? He was standing in the middle of the room, stark naked, vigorously rubbing his wet hair with a towel, another two tossed in the corner by the dressing table. James looked down, then up. The talk about Andrew's legendary libido and stamina had undoubtedly been exaggerated. Staff were particularly invisible, as far as he was concerned, since they were there to serve, and not to question his actions. As a result, he was not the most popular man to work for at Buckingham Palace. In particular, it was his thoughtlessness that upset most of the housemaids and valets who worked under him. This next bit is so disgusting. Apparently, his bedtime habits as a single man left a lot to be desired, and a collection of scrunched-up soiled tissues usually lay scattered around the bed each morning for the staff to collect after they had made up his bed. What in the world is that? How could you be such a disgusting human being? That guy is literally the worst! There was a good example of offhanded manner that evening as Diana and Sarah were reading the boys their bedtime story. A telephone call intended for the pantry was somehow misdirected through to the drawing room where Andrew was flicking through some magazines. Frances Simpson, the Kensington Palace housekeeper, was on the line and didn't recognize his voice. When she asked for me, Andrew apparently replied, "Wrong buddy room, idiot," before hanging up. The lack of manners! Andrew was the antithesis of Edward, who, whenever he came up to Highgrove, either alone or with a girlfriend, was utterly charming and polite. Where Andrew would barge in front of you through a doorway, Edward would stop, step to one side, and let you through, whoever you were. But what's interesting is that whenever Andrew and Sarah were there, Diana was a different person. But whenever she's there with Charles, the atmosphere is tense, she's buttoned up, she doesn't want to go outside, she doesn't want to hang around with him, she says Highgrove's the problem. Highgrove's not the problem. The problem is she's there with somebody who doesn't like her and she knows it and it's uncomfortable. That evening, with William and Harry safely tucked up in bed in the nursery, Andrew, Diana, and Sarah had dinner on card tables in the sitting room. As we all traipsed up to the staff sitting room after supper, we could hear the sound of laughter. It was the first time we had heard real happiness in that room for some time. Well, they decided to keep on being happy, at least Sarah and Andrew did, because the following morning suggested that the night before had been particularly riotous in the guest rooms. By all evidence, Andrew and Sarah had decided to try out both beds in the space of a few hours. As I replaced the voluminous linen sheets on the king-size beds, I felt quite entitled to a little moan. Having Sarah and Andrew to stay was going to mean quite a lot of work. Several staff at Buckingham Palace had warned me that I would be changing both beds every day for the length of their visit. Oh, think of all the laundry. How gross. Can't they just keep it to one bed? Must they make so much work for others? At Highgrove, without her husband, Diana seemed to flourish as never before. She suddenly took much more interest in the gardens and grounds, accompanying the boys and Andrew and Sarah outside in the cold, where normally she would have chosen to stay indoors. William was by this time now able to sit comfortably on his pony Smoky with the help of the groom, and he loved being able to show off his riding skills to the grown-ups. Diana had decked the boys out in trendy jeans and sweaters, and the whole group had races in the garden until lunch, which they ate at the dining room. This was a treat for the boys as well, since normally they had their food upstairs with Nanny in the nursery. That afternoon it rained, and the children and the adults mingled freely around the rooms. Everyone was in and out of each other's rooms, like some large extended family. Seeing Diana at Highgrove with people of her own generation, it suddenly struck me that it could be the happy family home that Charles intended when he moved in. The trouble was that it only seemed relaxed when either he or Diana wasn't there. Put them together, and the problems resurfaced all over again. The Monday morning before they left, Sarah popped her head round the kitchen door and asked for some more writing paper for her room. I was struck by how pleasant but ordinary she was in the flesh without any proper makeup on. Dressed in a long skirt and jumper, with her hair tied into a ponytail, she looked more like a prep school matron than a duchess-in-waiting. "I've just got to send some letters through, on Highgrove paper," she giggled. "I promised a friend who will be so terribly impressed." If only Sarah Ferguson had stayed like that, an excitable, unpretentious, upper-class girl. Marriage brought her attention and a list of privileges that she could never have dreamed of. It was quite to turn her head. That Monday, Diana was picked up by the red Royal helicopter at 2:30 p.m. As she walked up the steps, she turned and waved to the staff who stood in the hallway to see her off. She looked happy and content, in control of her own life, and at ease with Charles safely out of the picture. Well, how unfortunate that the times you are the happiest is when the lover of your life is nowhere around. Storm clouds, storm clouds. The change was remarkable the following weekend when Charles and Diana were back together at Highgrove. A cold, hard wind blew outside, but it was nothing compared to the chill within. There was none of the relaxed atmosphere of the weekend before, and Diana looked on the verge of tears for much of the time. Like most of the staff, I tried very hard not to take sides or form judgments about what was going on between them as they stormed or argued around the house. I suppose that I just wanted them to kiss and make up and make our lives easier as well as theirs. But it was on that early February weekend that I began to see the absolute desperation and frustration felt by both the prince and princess, having to live with a marriage that was patently falling apart at the seams. Now the problem here is that they don't just not like each other, they have developed disdain for each other. And when that creeps in, there's really not much you can do about the relationship. The loss of respect is very hard to put back together and put back into a relationship unless both people are really willing to work hard. But once disdain has entered into the relationship, you can just kiss things goodbye. And it would appear that the prince just has open indifference and disdain. And this story here illustrates it. She says that the prince's indifference would have been crushing for anyone. One afternoon, as the boys were playing upstairs with Barbara, Diana raced out after her husband as he marched through the back door to look at his Aston Martin in the garage. As he strode over the slippery wooden coal hole cover, Diana followed close behind, slipped, and ended up on her bottom. Charles carried on walking and didn't even bother to look behind him, as Diana sat whimpering in the drizzle. Patty later laughed about Diana going arse over tit on the board, but I found the whole scene extremely upsetting. The prince seemed to have grown so indifferent to his wife, so aloof and uncaring, that I realized then that a long-term reconciliation was unlikely. However difficult and devious she might be, and however much she might have been to blame for their marriage problems, my heart bled for Diana. Nevertheless, despite the hurt and anger, the royal show had to continue, as much for the sake of the children as for queen and country. Now, speaking of the children, Wendy goes on to talk about Nanny Barnes, and things are on the rocks with Nanny Barnes. Nanny Barnes is old school, and Diana wants things to be different. She wants them to be new and fresh and young, and she wants to bring some modernity to this whole nanny involvement in the family. There's a lot of jealousy that Diana feels for Nanny Barnes, but I also think that Nanny Barnes is kind of jealous of Diana because she wants the role and she wants the say in the boys' lives. She wants to be the mom, and she kind of looks at Diana as sort of, putting her stick in the works. And they don't see things equally. They don't agree on how to raise these kids. So the bond and closeness between Barbara and the boys meant that there was no tantrums or scenes while their parents were away skiing. Everything followed a set routine, and they would be woken and dressed at the same time every morning. Occasionally, William would refuse to wear his gloves or raincoat, and would then be told in no uncertain terms by Barbara that he wouldn't be going out at all that day unless he did. All the staff were told by Diane and Charles to tell the boys off if they were rude or naughty, but it was only allowed to be a verbal ticking off. Diana was vehemently against slapping the children, and only rarely did it herself. If she heard that somebody else had done it, she would have hit the roof. The most important time for the boys, when their parents were away, was just about 6:30 p.m., when they were getting ready for bed. Clad in green and white striped pajamas and clutching their teddy bears, they would wait expectantly for a call from their mother or father. Diana hated leaving them behind, and Barbara was required to give a highly detailed account of everything that they had been up to during the day before she hung up. Barbara was used to and enjoyed being the formal royal nanny, and found it difficult to understand why Diana wanted to take such an active part in her children's upbringing, when so many other royals had handed over their responsibility to the nannies. Since the end of October 1985, William had attended a £200 a term private nursery in Notting Hill, West London, which was taming him a little, but Barbara still felt it necessary to make him conform to what she thought was the proper dress and behavior of a young boy who would one day be king. "He needs to be treated differently because he is different," Barbara would often say. "It's no good Diana pretending that he can have a completely normal life, because he can't." If only somebody had told Harry that. It was already possible to see the seeds of discontent growing between Diana and Barbara. Eventually, they would turn into a power battle, which Diana would win. Barbara would listen patiently as Diana explained she wanted the boys dressed in the clothes she had chosen, and not kitted out in these old-fashioned, boring gear that made them look as if they were from a different era. Would grumble quietly about the state of their shoes and the holes in their favorite trousers, as she took control after the boys had spent a weekend alone with their mother. "We'd better be having you out of these things, hadn't we, William?" she would say as Diana pulled off for an official engagement. "They'll be falling off you soon, unless we change." William and Harry addressed her as Baba, and even though she could sometimes be very strict with them, both boys adored her. Well, trouble's brewing at every corner, but there's one place where trouble isn't brewing. Charles seems to be unusually happy these days, but what from? No sooner were the prince and princess back from their skiing trip than Charles flew off to Texas. Before he left, on February 17th, he walked around the house with me, pointing out the areas he wished me to discuss with the interior designer, who had decorated much of the house in the early days. By the end of our half-hour visit, I had 2 sheets of paper covered with instructions. "Oh, and by the way, I've arranged to send you to a flower arranging course in London. Now, you mustn't take offense," he added, "because I know you do them very nicely in your own particular way. I just thought it might be a good idea for you to learn a few different new arrangements with the professionals." Such attention to detail was typical of the prince. As he left, I thought there couldn't be many men who would have considered sending their housekeeper to London for a flower arranging course, let alone the Prince of Wales. Charles seemed more alive and enthusiastic than I had ever seen him before, as we walked around discussing Highgrove. "The prince looks happy," I said to one of the policemen as I walked down to the lodge after he'd left for America. "I wonder why," he replied with a knowing grin. "He must be in love," I said absent-mindedly. "Perhaps," he answered. "But with whom?" And that's the end of today's reading. I would dearly love to go on, but we cannot. I've reached my hour, so that's that. But are you guys loving this as much as I am? Look at the little details. I don't like Andrew. That little bit about him and the tissues around the bed, so gross and so slovenly. That's the word. Slovenly. Well, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys later this week. Bye.